clock itself, which will be done here and in Stanford simultaneously. My colleagues are going to offer their comments on the report. So after their short introductory remarks, will be followed by comments from our guests at Stanford, who will be introduced by John. And John Mecklin is the fluid pen that has made it possible for the ideas of so many to come together into one coherent and powerful voice. So by way of very quick introduction, let me introduce to you Lawrence Krauss, who's the inaugural director of the Origins Initiative at Arizona State University, and the foundation professor of ASU's School of Earth and Space Exploration and the Physics Department, and he is the chair of our board of sponsors, which includes the Nobel Prize winners that we consult as we put this together. Thomas Pickering has served as Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs and as U.S. Ambassador to the Russian Federation, India, Israel, El Salvador, Nigeria, and Jordan, and he was the U.S. Ambassador and Representative to the United Nations. Shivan Kartha is a senior scientist at the Stockholm Environment Institute, whose research has focused mostly on equity and efficiency in the design of an international climate regime over the last several years. Sharon Squassoni is a senior fellow and director of the Proliferation Prevention Program at CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies here in Washington, D.C., and has served in numerous government positions. As many of you in the room know, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists has been setting the Doomsday Clock since 1947. It has moved 21 times in 69 years, 22 times in 69 years. The clock is a metaphor for how close we are from destroying the planet. It is a summary view of leading experts deeply engaged in the existential challenges of our time. Each year, the Bulletin is able to generate a global conversation around nuclear security, climate change, existential threats, and other existential threats, and the role and responsibilities that citizens and leaders have in determining how safe or dangerous our world is. As of this morning, the conversation has already started, and I'm pleased to say that the Doomsday Clock is a top 10 trending story in the United States on Twitter. After serious discussions and consultations, the Science and Security Board has arrived at its conclusion, and it says with utter dismay that the clock remains at 3 minutes to midnight. It is remains the closest it has been over the last 20 years. And I will leave it to my colleagues to explain the reasoning, starting first with Dr. Lawrence Krauss.
Thank you, Rachel. As Rachel mentioned, I'm Lawrence Krauss, and I'm privileged to be the chair of the board of sponsors of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which currently includes 16 Nobel laureates and was created by Albert Einstein and Robert Oppenheimer almost 70 years ago to advise the board. Each year, the Bulletin Science and Security Board has a very difficult task because we're balancing many disparate factors to realistically address the fundamental existential threats facing humanity. Importantly, the board focuses not just on one specific area or one specific event. For example, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the clock was not moved at all, but balances all challenges and threats, progress and setbacks over the recent period on a worldwide basis. The situation has become more complex as the Bulletin began to explore issues beyond nuclear weapons in the last decade, including global climate change and, most recently, possible bioterrorism and global cyber threats. The icy conditions today in Washington are particularly appropriate for the announcement made today, as the clock remains at the closest to the brink since 1983, when U.S.-Russian tensions were also at their iciest in decades. There are reasons for this. First, developments have been mixed since we moved the clock forward a year ago. In spite of some positive news, in particular the Iran nuclear agreement and the Paris Climate Accord, nuclear tensions between the U.S. and Russia have grown. The situation in North Korea has become more acute. Tensions between Pakistan and India remain high, even as those countries increase their nuclear arsenals. And nuclear modernization programs in the U.S. and Russia violate the spirit, and I believe the letter, of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Paris notwithstanding, the fight against climate change has barely begun, and it is unclear that the nations of the world are ready to make the many hard choices that will be necessary to stabilize the climate and avert possible environmental disasters. The major challenges the Bulletin laid out for governments a year ago have not been addressed, even as the overall global challenges we need to face become more urgent. A year ago, the clock was moved forward to 3 minutes to midnight. At that time, the Bulletin stated, the clock ticks now at just 3 minutes to midnight because international leaders are failing to perform their most important duty, ensuring and preserving the health and vitality of human civilization. The decision not to move the hands of the Doomsday Clock in 2016 is not good news, but an expression of grave concern that the situation remains largely the same. Let me stress one particular example here. The clock was moved back several years ago after the election of Barack Obama and his pledge to attempt to move toward a goal of a world without nuclear weapons. While this administration has moved forward on several diplomatic fronts, the U.S. now appears committed to nuclear weapons modernizations that could cost between $100 billion and $1 trillion. Aside from the damaging impact on our economy, what message does this send to non-nuclear nations about our intents? This is exacerbated by exploration of smaller, usable, nuclear-tipped missiles capable of attacking underground bunkers. There is no sane strategic use of nuclear weapons, and we need to reduce our nuclear arsenal, not create a new generation of weapons. It makes economic as well as strategic sense, and is part of our non-proliferation commitment. To help move the clock back, and the world move to a safer place, the bulletin calls on the citizens of the world to demand of their leaders: 1. Dramatically reduce proposed spending on nuclear weapons modernization programs. 2. Re-energize the disarmament process with focus on results. 3. Engage North Korea to reduce nuclear risks. 4. Follow up in the Paris Accord with actions that sharply reduce greenhouse gas emissions and fulfill the Paris promise of keeping warming below 2 degrees Celsius. 5. Deal now with commercial nuclear waste problems. And 6. Create institutions specifically assigned to explore and address potentially catastrophic misuses of new technologies. The challenges facing humanity became global when full-scale nuclear war became a real possibility shortly after the Second World War. Climate change has only exacerbated the situation. 20th century business-as-usual approaches are not appropriate for the 21st century to deal with either of these challenges. As Einstein said,